She didn't disappear after a scandal, a meltdown, or a public humiliation. There was no headline, no controversy, no moment caught on camera that explained what went wrong. One day, she was simply there, and then she wasn't. No announcement, no explanation. Just silence. Not long before that, she had been Johnny Carson's golden girl. She was welcomed regularly onto America's most powerful stage, laughed with, trusted, and even handed the keys to the desk when Carson stepped away. She wasn't just another guest, she was part of the inner circle. And then, without warning, she was never invited back. No cameo, no tribute, not even a quiet acknowledgement after the applause faded and the ratings moved on. So how does someone who appeared frequently on national television become invisible overnight? If there was no scandal, no public betrayal, no obvious mistake, then who decided she no longer belonged? And what is more terrifying, being attacked in public or being erased so quietly that no one even dares to ask why? To understand what really happened, you have to understand the world she lived in. There was a time when one show held the keys to Hollywood. 5 minutes on The Tonight Show could change your life. A single wave from Johnny Carson could launch a career, and just as quietly, the absence of that wave could end one. Behind the laughter, the applause, and the effortless charm was a system built on rules no one dared to say out loud. A system where silence was power, loyalty mattered more than talent, and crossing an invisible line even by accident could cost you everything. This isn't just the story of one woman. It's the story of how an empire of late-night television decided who mattered and who would be erased. To understand how someone could be erased so completely, you first have to understand just how powerful The Tonight Show really was during its peak. This wasn't just a late-night talk show. It was the center of gravity for American entertainment, the place where careers were made, validated, and quietly destroyed. In a world before social media, before podcasts, before viral clips and algorithmic fame, visibility was everything. If you wanted to be taken seriously as a comedian, an actor, or a rising star, there was one path that mattered more than any other. You needed those 5 minutes on Johnny Carson's stage, not a movie premiere, not a magazine cover. 5 minutes at that desk could do more for your future than years of grinding ever could. Johnny Carson understood that power better than anyone. With a single nod, a laugh held just a second longer, or a subtle wave of his hand, he could signal to the entire industry that someone was worth paying attention to. That wave, inviting a performer from center stage to the interview chair, became the most valuable gesture in late-night television. It wasn't written into any contract, but everyone knew what it meant. Comedians like David Letterman and Jerry Seinfeld have both spoken openly about how that moment changed everything for them. One appearance turned into more bookings, better deals, and doors that suddenly opened without explanation. Carson didn't just host the show, he acted as a gatekeeper, deciding who would be welcomed into the inner circle and who would remain on the outside. What most viewers at home never realized was that the real judgment didn't happen during the applause. You could crush your set, bring the house down, and still fail the test. The verdict came afterward, in silence. Did Johnny wave you over? Did you get that chair? Or did the camera cut away while you stood alone under the lights? Behind the smiles and the effortless charm was a system built on control and unspoken rules. Carson hated surprises. He hated losing rhythm. And more than anything, he hated being upstaged on his own stage. You could be funny, just never funnier than Johnny. Cross that invisible line, even by accident, and the consequences didn't come with an argument or a warning. They came later, quietly, when the invitations stopped. This is the world she lived in. A world where approval could change your life and where silence could end it just as quickly. What made the power of The Tonight Show so terrifying wasn't just how visible it was, but how quietly it could be taken away. There were no dramatic bannings, no on-air confrontations, no public announcements explaining why someone had suddenly vanished from the guest list. In most cases, nothing was ever said at all. That silence wasn't accidental. It was the system working exactly as intended. When a guest stopped appearing, there was no explanation offered to the audience at home, and certainly no defense given to the person who had been cut off. One week they were there, the next week they weren't, and life on television moved on as if nothing had changed. Behind the scenes, however, everyone understood what that silence meant. Bookers stopped calling. Studio executives grew cautious. Other shows quietly kept their distance, afraid of stepping on the wrong toes. No one needed Johnny Carson to publicly ban anyone. The message traveled faster without words. If Johnny was done with you, the industry knew it, and it responded accordingly. What made this form of punishment so effective was its ambiguity. There was no rule you could point to, no line you could clearly say you had crossed. The lack of explanation wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the weapon. It forced everyone else to guess, to overcorrect, and to stay safely within invisible boundaries they couldn't fully see. And that silence didn't just punish one person. It warned everyone else watching. Every comedian backstage, every agent, every producer saw what happened when someone slipped out of favor. The absence became a lesson. Don't ask questions, don't push too far, and above all, don't give Johnny a reason to turn cold. In a system like this, silence was louder than any insult. It didn't need to humiliate you in public or destroy you with headlines. It simply erased you from the conversation. And once that happened, there was no appeal, no explanation, and no way back in. What made the system even more dangerous was that none of its rules were ever written down. There was no handbook for guests, no clear line that explained what was acceptable and what wasn't. Everyone learned the rules the same way by watching what happened to the people who crossed them. One rule, however, was understood by almost everyone who stepped onto that stage: never upstage Johnny. You could be funny, sharp, and memorable, but you could never be more than that. Carson didn't need to be loud or confrontational to enforce this. All he had to do was protect the rhythm of his show, because control of the rhythm meant control of the room. Johnny Carson hated surprises, not because he disliked jokes or spontaneity, but because surprises threatened his timing. They broke the invisible structure he had perfected over decades. When a guest hijacked the moment, stretched a punchline too long, or pulled the spotlight away from the desk, it wasn't just bad manners, it was a challenge. Comedians learned to read his temperature in real time. If the smile stayed but the laughter shortened, if the follow-up questions stopped, if the wave never came, they knew something had shifted. The audience might still be laughing, but backstage, everyone could feel the air change. That was the cruel genius of Carson's system. You could walk off stage believing you had done great, only to realize later that you had failed the test that actually mattered. There was no argument, no warning, and no chance to explain yourself. The punishment didn't arrive with anger, it arrived with distance. And because there was no rule book, fear filled the gaps. Agents advised caution, producers whispered warnings. Comedians pulled back their best material, afraid of crossing a line they couldn't see. In Johnny's world, uncertainty wasn't a flaw, it was the mechanism. It kept everyone guessing, compliant, and careful long after the cameras stopped rolling. Long before anyone talked openly about bans or blacklists, there were warning signs. Small moments that didn't make headlines, but were noticed immediately by people who worked inside the system. These were the quiet signals that something had gone wrong, even if no one ever said it out loud. One of the clearest examples was Rich Little. He was wildly popular for his spot-on impressions, including his impressions of Johnny Carson himself. Audiences loved it. Carson even laughed at first, but over time, the jokes hit too close to home. What started as playful mimicry slowly began to feel like repetition, then irritation, and finally, something more dangerous: familiarity. Officially, the explanation was simple. Rich Little's material had gone stale. That was the word used. No fight, no confrontation. Just fewer bookings, then none at all. But everyone in comedy understood the subtext. Making fun of Johnny was only acceptable as long as Johnny decided it was. Once that tolerance disappeared, so did the invitations. Then there was Dana Carvey. At the height of his fame while promoting Wayne's World, Carvey performed a pitch-perfect Johnny Carson impression on television. It was sharp, affectionate, and devastatingly accurate. The audience loved it. Carson did not. He never criticized it publicly. He never explained his reaction. He simply never invited Dana Carvey back. That was how the system worked. You were rarely told what you did wrong. You were just removed. And because there was no announcement, no scandal, and no clear line that had been crossed, the message traveled quietly but efficiently. If even beloved, successful comedians could disappear overnight, then no one was truly safe. These early cases weren't about rebellion or open disrespect. They were about proximity to power, about getting too comfortable, too familiar, or too confident around the wrong person. They showed everyone else watching that the line wasn't just invisible, it could move without warning. By the time people realized what had happened, it was already too late. And the most important lesson was clear. Once Johnny Carson decided you didn't belong anymore, the industry didn't ask questions. It followed his lead. If there was anyone Johnny Carson truly elevated, protected, and believed in, it was Joan Rivers. In the early 1960s, she was a sharp, fearless comedian in an industry that barely made room for women. Club owners dismissed her. Executives called her washed up before she had even turned 32. Then Johnny Carson brought her onto The Tonight Show, and everything changed. She didn't just do well, she crushed it. After one of her earliest appearances, Carson turned to the camera and told America, "You're going to be hearing a lot about this girl." That sentence launched a career. Overnight, Joan Rivers went from grinding in comedy clubs to becoming a regular presence on the most powerful show in television. Carson mentored her, championed her, and eventually trusted her enough to let her guest host the show in his absence. To the outside world, it looked like succession, but behind the scenes, reality was far colder. NBC had no intention of giving Joan Rivers The Tonight Show when Carson eventually stepped down. She wasn't even being considered when Fox Broadcasting Company approached her in 1986 with an offer to launch her own late-night show. She was terrified. It was historic, the chance to become the first woman to host a major late-night program, but it also meant crossing the most dangerous line in Johnny Carson's world. The decision itself wasn't what broke everything. The silence was. Joan didn't tell Carson first. He found out through the industry grapevine. To Carson, this wasn't business. It was betrayal. He didn't argue with her. He didn't confront her publicly. He simply shut the door and never opened it again. When Joan called, he hung up. When she wrote, he never replied. For years, she sent letters hoping for a single response. None ever came. She wasn't just removed from the guest list. She was erased. Clips of her appearances disappeared from The Tonight Show archives. Her name went unmentioned. Anyone who appeared on her Fox show suddenly found themselves unwelcome on Johnny's couch. For Joan Rivers, the pain never faded. In interviews decades later, her voice still cracked when she spoke about Carson. She called him the single most important figure in her career. She admitted she cried when he died in 2005, not just because the world had lost a legend, but because she had lost her mentor without ever being allowed to say goodbye. This wasn't a feud played out in public. It was a punishment delivered through silence, loyalty, and absolute control. And it became the clearest example of how Carson's power worked when it was personal. Not everyone who disappeared from The Tonight Show crossed Johnny Carson in the same way. Some weren't punished for betrayal, ego, or ambition. Some didn't insult anyone, challenge authority, or even realize they had done anything wrong. In many cases, a single moment misunderstood, uncleared, or poorly timed was enough to quietly end everything. Take Bobcat Goldthwait, whose wild, chaotic energy made him a cult favorite. During a guest appearance, he pushed a stunt far beyond the limits of live television by intentionally setting the host's chair on fire. It was meant to shock and amuse, but it crossed a line the network couldn't ignore. Even though Johnny Carson wasn't hosting that night, the reaction was immediate. Bobcat was banned from the show, arrested, convicted of arson, fined thousands of dollars, and sentenced to record public service announcements about fire safety. One moment of chaos permanently closed the door. Then there was Kathy Griffin, whose career was built on being loud, fearless, and unapologetic. Her comedy challenged social boundaries and often made people uncomfortable, especially within the tightly controlled world of late-night television. Carson may not have personally banned her, but she embodied exactly the kind of unpredictability that would never have survived under his rule. Over time, she found herself quietly shut out of The Tonight Show and other platforms, not because of one explosive incident, but because she refused to soften her edge. Sometimes the mistake wasn't offensive at all, it was simply unapproved. Howie Mandel learned this early in his career. Hoping to stand out, he brought a giant stuffed tiger on stage without clearing it with producers. It was harmless, silly, and meant to get a laugh. But Johnny Carson hated surprises, especially ones that disrupted the rhythm of his show. There was no argument, no explanation, and no public fallout. Howie Mandel was simply never invited back. Then there was Lola Falana, whose case revealed yet another invisible boundary. During an appearance, she spoke openly and honestly about racism in the entertainment industry, describing the reality of being a black woman in Hollywood at a time when most people avoided those conversations entirely. She wasn't angry or reckless, she was truthful. But late-night television wasn't ready for that discomfort. After that night, she never received another invitation. Not because she was wrong, but because the system wasn't built to handle honesty that challenged its comfort. But here's where the pattern becomes even clearer. Not everyone who survived Carson's world did so by accident, and not everyone who played it safe disappeared. Melanie Chartoff never caused trouble. She didn't swear on air. She didn't insult anyone in front of the cameras. The jokes she made were light, playful, and often about small, harmless observations. She regularly made the crew laugh, and even Johnny himself laughed along. She understood the rhythm, respected the boundaries, and never tried to pull the spotlight away from the desk. As a result, she had no issues with Carson. She appeared multiple times on The Tonight Show, including a memorable episode in 1982 alongside George Burns and Richard Dawson. She didn't survive because she was louder, sharper, or more daring. She survived because she made Johnny feel comfortable. And that contrast explains everything. This system didn't just punish defiance, it rewarded predictability. It didn't only erase those who crossed the line, it protected those who never made Johnny feel threatened. Talent mattered, timing mattered, but above all else, control mattered. In Carson's world, staying visible wasn't about how funny you were. It was about whether you fit safely inside the boundaries he never had to explain. Up to this point, being shut out of late-night television has sounded like a professional death sentence, and most of the time, it was. For many performers, losing access to that stage meant losing momentum, relevance, and opportunity all at once. But there was one rare exception, a case that didn't fit the pattern, and in doing so, revealed something deeper about how power could sometimes collide with consequence. That exception was Arty Lang. Arty wasn't banned by Johnny Carson. By the time his career peaked, Carson had already retired. Instead, Arty found himself shut out years later by another late-night gatekeeper, Conan O'Brien. At the time, it felt just as brutal. Arty was volatile, unpredictable, and spiraling through addiction, and Conan's team eventually decided they couldn't manage the chaos anymore. There was no public shaming, no on-air condemnation, just the familiar silence. The phone stopped ringing. The invitations dried up, and for Arty Lang, it felt like everything he had worked for was collapsing at once. But this time, something different happened. Instead of destroying him, the ban forced a pause. With nowhere to perform and nowhere to hide, Arty was finally confronted with the reality of his situation. Years later, after getting sober, he would openly admit that being cut off was the moment that saved his life. Losing access to the stage didn't erase him, it stopped him long enough to survive. That's what makes Arty's story so unsettling. It proves that the system itself wasn't inherently moral or immoral. It was indifferent. When wielded without empathy, it crushed careers. When applied with restraint, even unintentionally, it could become a lifeline. But Arty Lang's outcome was the exception, not the rule. For every story of recovery, there were dozens of silent disappearances, people who never got a second act, never got closure, and never understood why the door had closed. And that contrast matters, because it reminds us of something uncomfortable. The same silence that erased others didn't change its nature, just because it helped one man. It was still power without explanation, control without transparency, and consequences delivered without consent. Arty survived it. Most people didn't. For a long time, Johnny Carson and Wayne Newton represented two sides of old-school show business. Carson ruled late-night television from behind his desk in Burbank, while Newton dazzled audiences in Las Vegas with polish, charm, and spectacle. When Wayne Newton appeared on The Tonight Show, it was smiles, jokes, and easy camaraderie. On the surface, everything looked friendly. But in Hollywood, friendship often comes with fine print. In the early 1980s, Newton made a move that changed everything. He outbid Carson for partial ownership of the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. To Newton, it was business, a smart investment in a city where he had built his brand. To Carson, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a challenge, a crossing of territory, a reminder that power didn't stop at the edge of the soundstage. Carson didn't confront Newton directly. He did what he always did best: he turned it into material. Night after night, jokes about Wayne Newton began slipping into Carson's monologues. They weren't playful jabs. They questioned Newton's appearance, his masculinity, his lifestyle, and even his character. The audience laughed because that's what audiences do. But this wasn't comedy for the person on the receiving end. It was public humiliation wrapped in a punchline. Eventually, Wayne Newton had enough. According to people close to the situation, he stormed into NBC studios without cameras or entourage and confronted Carson backstage. The details vary depending on who tells the story, but the outcome was clear. The jokes stopped, and so did the relationship. Wayne Newton was never invited back to The Tonight Show. Not as a guest, not for a friendly appearance, not even as nostalgia. Once again, the pattern held. When Carson closed the door, it stayed closed. This feud mattered because it exposed something important. Carson's power wasn't limited to comedians or rising stars. It extended to established icons. And it wasn't just about control of the stage, it was about territory, ego, and dominance. In Johnny Carson's world, disagreements weren't negotiated. They were absorbed, redirected, and quietly resolved through exclusion. No press release, no explanation, just distance. And by the time people realized what had happened, the story had already ended. To understand why Johnny Carson wielded silence the way he did, you have to look beyond the desk and the monologue and toward the man who stepped off stage when the cameras stopped. The version America saw every night, relaxed, witty, effortlessly in control, was carefully constructed. Behind it was someone far more guarded, private, and uneasy with intimacy. Johnny Carson didn't let people get close easily. Friends, co-workers, and even guests who believed they had bonded with him often discovered, sometimes abruptly, that they had misread the distance. He was charming, generous with laughs, and devastatingly quick with a joke, but he also kept strict emotional boundaries. Everything had its place, and everyone had a role. When someone drifted outside that structure, the temperature dropped. Control mattered to Carson, not just on stage, but in life. He hated unpredictability, hated being surprised, and hated feeling exposed. That need for control shaped how he hosted, how he interacted, and how he responded when he felt cornered. Instead of confrontation, he chose withdrawal. Instead of arguments, he chose silence. It was cleaner, safer, and far more effective. That personality trait explains a lot about what happened to the people who vanished from his world. Carson didn't explode. He didn't rant. He didn't demand loyalty out loud. He simply removed access, and because his platform was so powerful, removing access was enough. Those closest to him described a man who was deeply private and, at times, profoundly lonely. He could fill a room with laughter, yet struggle to maintain closeness once the lights went down. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who made America feel like his friend often kept real relationships at arm's length. This tension followed him everywhere, into his marriages, his friendships, and eventually his retreat from public life. And it helps explain why, when Johnny Carson turned cold, he never turned back. Silence wasn't just a professional weapon. It was how he protected himself. For all the mastery Johnny Carson displayed on television, his private life was far messier than the smooth performance America saw every night. If the desk was where he ruled with confidence and control, home was where that control often slipped away. Over the course of his life, Johnny Carson was married 4 times, and each marriage followed a familiar pattern of early excitement, growing distance, and quiet collapse. Fame amplified everything: the late nights, the constant attention, and the ego that came with being the most powerful man in late-night television made stability nearly impossible. Carson later admitted that fidelity was never his strength, and the jokes he made on air about his divorces were less confidence than armor. His marriages to Jody Wolcott and Joanne Copeland unraveled as his career exploded. Publicly, Carson laughed it off, once quipping that his ex-wives walked away with everything but his cufflinks. But behind the humor was isolation. His third marriage to Joanna Holland followed the same trajectory, glamorous on the surface, strained underneath. By the time he married Alexis Moss in 1987, something had shifted. The relationship was quieter, more private, and far removed from the spotlight, as if Carson had finally grown tired of letting the world inside. But the deepest fracture wasn't romantic, it was personal. Carson's relationship with his son Rick was strained and complicated, shaped by distance, pressure, and the impossible weight of expectation. Rick struggled with substance abuse and legal trouble for years, often in full view of the public. When Rick died in a tragic car accident in 1991, Carson was shattered. For the first time, the man who controlled every moment on television appeared visibly fragile. When he returned to the screen, the sadness wasn't hidden behind a punchline. Not long after, Carson stepped away from The Tonight Show. In 1992, he retired quietly, without a farewell tour or a dramatic reinvention. He didn't move on to another project. He didn't chase relevance. He simply disappeared from public life, retreating to Malibu, spending time on his yacht, and turning down nearly every interview request that came his way. For someone who had spent decades controlling the national conversation, the withdrawal was striking. But it was also consistent. Just as Carson had removed others from his world without explanation, he removed himself the same way. No spectacle, no closure, just distance. In the end, the collapse of his personal life didn't contradict the man America knew. It completed him. The silence that defined his power on television followed him home and stayed with him until the very end. By the time Johnny Carson quietly faded from public life, his influence was already irreversible. He didn't just host a television show, he designed a system. The desk, the monologue, the couch, the musical guest, the rhythm of banter, followed by applause, all of it became the blueprint for late-night television. Every host who came after him inherited that structure, whether they acknowledged it or not. You can see Carson's DNA in the relaxed charm of Jimmy Fallon, the sharp edges of Jimmy Kimmel, and even the controlled irony of Stephen Colbert. They changed the tone, modernized the jokes, and adapted to new audiences, but the foundation never disappeared. What did disappear was the kind of absolute power Carson once held. Today, no single show can make or end a career overnight. Social media, podcasts, streaming platforms, and viral clips have shattered the monopoly that late-night television once enjoyed. A performer who is ignored by one gatekeeper can now find an audience somewhere else. Silence no longer carries the same weight it once did. And yet, the echoes remain. The fear of displeasing the host, the unspoken rules, the understanding that access still matters, just in different forms. Johnny Carson's world was harsher, more centralized, and far less forgiving, but it was also clearer. You knew where the power lived. You knew who held the keys. Today's system is louder, faster, and more chaotic, but it hasn't completely escaped those old instincts. It has simply redistributed them. Carson never wrote a memoir. He never sat down for a tell-all interview. He never explained himself to the people he shut out or to the audience that adored him. When he died in 2005, the curtain fell the same way it always had, quietly, without explanation and without closure. That silence is part of his legacy. He was a master of timing, a cultural force, and a man who could command an entire nation's attention with a single glance. But he was also someone who believed that distance was safer than confrontation, and that control was easier to maintain when it was never discussed. And that's the strange contradiction at the heart of Johnny Carson's story. You didn't have to know him to feel like you did. But knowing him, truly knowing him, was something very few people were ever allowed to do.